It's like 2 days in a row where I'm coming home from work with like blue stuff on my hands. It's not gonna show up in the camera, whatever. This is actually the second time I've recorded this entire video, a project I'd originally set to making as far back as 3 or 4 years ago. It's been long enough that the entirety of Korra is now nearly a decade in the rear view, which frankly doesn't feel real. Legend of Korra is now nearly as much of an object of nostalgia for me as The Last Airbender before it, and I'm determined to have my semi-recent appraisal of it as a complete work on record. So we're doing this, going over the whole roller coaster from my perspective. What works about this show looking back, what I'd change, what feelings are different now versus when the show aired, the works. That said, talking about this show is going to be quite the Herculean feat. Maybe I should simplify things a bit. Okay, here's the Legend of Korra seasons ranked by how obnoxious Milo is in each one. No, I can't fold to pressure. I decided to do this video, now I have to commit. Like and subscribe while you're here, and spoilers for the whole show, obviously. Speaking of pressure, the pressure was on for The Legend of Korra Season 1. Pretty much as early as when it was announced. The Last Airbender hadn't quite achieved the unassailable classic reputation it has today. It had only been off the air for 4 years, but let me tell you, I was in Airbender's target audience as it came out, and it's still the only multi-season TV show that I've ever caught every episode of upon its initial airing. At least as far as cable goes. It's also one of only 2 TV shows I ever watched from beginning to end with my dad. So I've got a lot of personal, nostalgic feelings swept up in that series beyond just how good it is in a vacuum. It was palpable from the moment it was announced. Even to somebody as young as I was at the time, The Legend of Korra was going to have to be pretty great to justify following up its predecessor. And with no second season promised to start with, you've got what's essentially a 5-ish hour mini-series worth of time to tell a story that enamors people as much as Airbender did. But hey, we had no reason to think it wasn't going to be great. From the initial announcement of a quote-unquote steampunk Avatar series, to teasers released ahead of the premiere, everything in the lead-up promised a rad time. And in a lot of ways, the first season lives up to that promise. While in a lot of ways, it does not. Starting with the small stuff, I'm a sucker for the 1920s to 1940s aesthetic of this show, and the way it's integrated into not just air, but all 4 seasons. It really helps give Korra a totally unique stylistic feel. The clothes, the music, beyond the art style shift and the more adolescent tone, if the idea was to set itself apart from Airbender stylistically, Book Air couldn't have done a better job. This goes beyond just the style, though. Last Airbender was comparatively subtle in the fact that we could see a nascent industrial revolution threaded through the story. Heck, one of our main characters was the guy who revolutionized warfare in real time by perfecting the hot air balloon and inventing the submarine. LOK builds smartly on this thematic idea by integrating the continued advancement of technology throughout the plot and setting. Taken as a whole, the show has not 1 but 2 captains of industry among its main cast, but just in the context of Season 1, technological advancement is the basis for the entire conflict as a believable thing, with, like, real tension and stuff. The way encroaching technology is represented through the Equalist is some great world building. In the obvious sense that weird stuff with Amon that we'll get into aside, you just know that a violent schism between benders and non-benders was inevitable as technical know-how eventually granted the latter camp a means of fighting on the former's level. It's the kind of thing you don't think about during Last Airbender, even though in retrospect it's absolutely a development that was bound to happen. And I think it's why, if you're under the impression that you're only going to get 1 season to work with, an anti-bending revolution makes perfect sense as the central conflict for an Avatar sequel series. If you're someone who's not thinking about the show on that level, this could almost cause some dissonance, in that time passing differently in real life compared to the show kind of way. In discussing Book Air with my friend Brianna, we agreed that it felt odd, the way skills which used to be unique to individual characters in ATLA became so completely democratized in Korra. Not good or bad, just odd. Chi blocking used to be an exclusively Ty Lee thing as far as the narrative went, and her unique nature as a non-bender who could school benders in a fight is part of what made her such a memorable presence. But now, that ability comes in something that any regular person can just slip on or off. The Legend of Korra believably pushes the setting of Avatar into a new age by using the passage of time to show us this democratization across the entire show. Things that used to be relatively exclusive get disseminated to the masses all throughout the series. Be that technology that lets non-benders compete with benders, access to and influence over spirits, access to airbending, or weapons of mass destruction. Heck, lightning bending and metal bending pop up all over the place as a matter of course, and the show nicely explores the pros and cons of each major advancement through how it gets rid of that exclusivity. Sadly, I think parts of Season 1 bungle the execution. Korra, the character, struggles greatly with the spiritual side of bending over the physical side, and unfortunately I think that rings true for the show's own approach to bending. It's difficult to articulate in regards to these first couple seasons, but while the choreography isn't bad, the bending also lacks a lot of that individuality and grace that it had in Airbender. All around, bending feels more like a generic elemental superpower than something with any kind of emotional or spiritual weight behind it, and that's both in the writing and the visuals. But whatever, getting back to positives, while there are some consistent animation techniques throughout the series which I find a bit jarring, but which I won't go into at length since I'm not an animator, you'd be hard-pressed to argue that LOK isn't a beautiful show. The character acting and action animation is spectacular and fluid. Just like Airbender, you can tell almost everything you need to know about the major characters by body language alone. Korra is confident, motivated, and a bit poorly socialized. Mako is focused, reserved, and awkward. Asami is clever, warm, and inviting. Bolin is sturdy, showy, and confident in a fight, and a ball of anxious, manic energy practically anywhere else. I'm also not a musician, though, so you'll have to just take me at my word when I say the music is sublime as well. The way the soundscape of Avatar is evolved and also infused with the 20s jazz sound is so distinct and memorable, and in a lot of ways makes the style of the first season. I really wish I was confident enough to speak more to either the animation or the music, since it's the most consistently praiseworthy thing about the show. But better voices than myself can and have spoken to that facet of it. It's in story and character that Season 1 is a harder knot to untangle. The shift from a series of episodic adventures across varied locales with a broad end goal to an action-driven political mystery thriller is one of those creative choices that reads like the property trying to grow up with its audience. This is your more quote-unquote mature Avatar series, with a far more serialized narrative structure, plus a more muted color palette to boot. The thing is, if you're going to go serial, make your show nice and binge-friendly, then the strengths of individual characters, episodes, or plot points is going to do little to assuage any problems in the central storyline. Heck, if you want an on-brand tangent, just look at any of the Marvel shows, be they on Disney Plus or on Netflix. Those shows tend to have pervasive issues with narrative and structure which tend to overwhelm the positives, even when those positives are noticeable and frequent. And unfortunately, it's all the recurring story elements where Korra Season 1 falters, by which I mean Korra's struggles with airbending, the romance, and the antagonists. Let me tackle these one by one, starting with the romance, so you know what I mean. Love stories have always been a part of Avatar. In The Last Airbender, you couldn't earthbend a rock in any direction without hitting a character who had a crush on someone, or a pair that was already coupled together, and displays of affection and ship-teasing all around. Honestly, there's some romantic angle in just about every other episode. In what reads as yet another effort to be more mature, though, appealing to teens over children, the soap opera-level love square between our mains and LOK is now a central story element. It practically dictates the majority of their interactions, in a way that was just never true for the mains in Airbender. The show feels almost like a slave to it, and personally I'm not here for it. Now look, if you know me, you know that I'm a romantic sap. When I latch onto a pairing in a show or a movie, I'm going to want to indulge as much as possible in moments of them just being cute together, complimenting each other's character, and yeah, even some good old-fashioned angsty drama, so long as it feels natural. But Legend of Korra Seasons 1 and 2 are pretty close to a perfect turn-off for me in terms of how they handle it. I just have no inclination toward the particular relationship dynamic that is Mako and Korra. What with the big explosive arguments and the angsting and the making moves on people who are already in relationships, just not for me, okay? These two really spend more time than not at each other's throats, and while that's arguably meant to be intentionally off-putting in Season 2, and in retrospect is allowed to read more as these characters being more comfortable as friends, in the moment of watching the first two seasons, it's always a drag, and I never find myself rooting for them to be together. Other, more prolific videos about this show have made their case regarding Korra as a nakedly obvious attempt to appeal to Zutara shippers, on an aesthetic level, if nothing else. Spirited, righteously indignant Water Tribe girl has a tumultuous relationship with angsty, serious Fire Nation boy. Only this time they do get together and the fangirls will eat it up. Needless to say that in a vacuum, this approach hurts these characters. Korra, comparatively, gets the bigger end of the stick, being the protagonist, and thus having a ton to do outside of the relationship. Mako, for most of the season, comes off like a very thin Zuko Xerox, attitude-wise. And a big reason he doesn't get to expand beyond those parameters is that his contribution to the story is mainly as a romantic object. It's not an extreme case. I'm not here to hit you with the hot take that Mako was secretly a sexy lamp the whole time. But Mako is, on the whole, defined by his status as love interest. The only reason he even has a relationship with Asami is to tighten the strings on Korra's feelings for him. Also, and maybe this is just because I've been rewatching Season 2 of Umbrella Academy, but is it me, or do the Asami-Mako scenes give off serious Sugar Mama vibes? Speaking of Asami, she actually gets to have more agency within the story than Mako does, and if nothing else, having the femme romantic false lead turn out to be a complex, likable character through the season instead of just duplicitous fodder for the love triangle is incredibly refreshing. This is especially true back in 2012, jeez. Asami is probably the most likable of the three by the end of the season, if I'm honest, even if she also is prey to dialogue scenes that are the worst kind of melodramatic in that way only teenage romance can be. And also many minus points from Korra for smooching a dude when you just went on a date with his brother. I don't care how much you try to milk Bolin's reaction for zany comedy show, that was just low. I mentioned Korra had some other things going on though, so let's get to what, on paper, is the primary struggle of the season, what it's named after, airbending. Now, like Aang's mastery of the other three elements, the actual learning process for Korra is hardly a huge focus of most scenes. The rare occasions it is the focus, I think, work fairly well, and this actually ties into the world building. Pro-bending is another one of those neat natural concepts that comes from progressing the Avatar world, and I like the way it's used early on to give Korra a pretty smart arc about being a stronger learner in a specific context. Korra fails to grasp airbending because of her lack of spiritual acuity, and part of her struggle is that she tries to treat spirituality like a game, something that she can win with enough vigor and willpower. In line with her pro-bending attitudes, this is also why she reacts to not getting it like a 30-something frat bro who just got schooled at ping pong by Elijah Wood.
Get him a body bag! Yeah!
Wilfie, quiet!
While this approach to spirituality is definitely not going to work long term, Korra can begin to take her first steps by learning through a game. The way she's able to take the principle of the air spinners and only really get it when she has to apply it into a sport is actually a brilliant sort of alternative learning character beat. And I wish we'd gotten more stuff like that, where Korra has to put into practice a different airbending principle every couple of episodes. Instead, what we end up getting just belies another one of the season's key problems, which is that Korra learning airbending takes a major backseat for the latter two-thirds of the show, only to be hastily resolved in the finale in a way that isn't really satisfying. This isn't like Aang learning earthbending or firebending, where we dedicate an episode to the actual learning part and then afterwards he makes a lot of very quick progress off-screen. Korra is completely unable to produce even a puff of air for the entire season. Her airbending out of nowhere to save Mako because Amon's taken all of her other options and she just really needs to punch harder is a criminal letdown of a resolution. This, along with even worse Aang ex Machina cop-out in the final moments of the episode, really spoils Korra's opportunity to meaningfully grow as a character, since she gets exactly what she needs handed to her by the story, with no self-reflection necessary. I just can't get over how backwards it feels to me to have the emotion that Korra needs to unlock her airbending be desperation. Like, I'm not being weird here, that just feels wrong, right, fundamentally? But hey, if you've watched this show, then I'm preaching to the choir at this point. I don't know anyone who really liked how rushed and unearned these parts of the ending were. Where I may deviate from a lot of people is in being generally lukewarm on the season's villains. Tarlok is an easy target. He doesn't get a lot of love, being a largely straight example of a fairly common archetype. Also, it's really stupid that he has his dad's post-plastic surgery face. But hey, his vocal performance is solid, and especially today, I appreciate how heavy we lean into the straight-up text of a corrupt politician targeting what are essentially oppressed minorities with the police force. I tell you man, rewatching this show in 2020 was a trip. But in almost all respects, he takes the backseat to Amon, and I gotta tell ya, it's hard to articulate why Amon doesn't work for me. And no, it's not just the way his identity comes out to the public being lazy and stupid. He's seemingly got everything you could want from a villain. The buttery yet intimidating voice of Steve Bloom, a striking character design, he's effective and intimidating, has an interesting Magneto-esque motivation, and he and Tarlok both have a really tragic backstory. So what about these guys stops me from being all that invested? For the sake of mystery, Amon is deliberately a complete blank until the penultimate episode of Season 1. Well, for that same stretch of time, Tarlok's motivations are very broadly drawn, and almost every conversation he has when not in smarmy brown-noser mode is pure exposition. Their shared backstory is interesting, if a bit contrived in places, and the way they both go out in the end is heavy, but neither are really super compelling as individual characters. We don't really get to know either of them. We don't get the aforementioned backstory until the back half of the penultimate episode, and I think if I were in charge, I'd have had this reveal much earlier. Sacrifice some of the mystery to show rather than tell the deeper aspects of these characters. I get it, Amon is meant to be a figurehead, and positions himself more like a force of nature than a person, and as that, he functions just fine. But with the main cast having their own characterization problems, a more human-feeling villain could have gone a long way. And yeah, let's talk about everyone else. I actually really like Tenzin and Lin, two authority figures who butt heads with Korra and each other in interesting ways. It's really sweet to see the pride that Tenzin takes when Korra puts on an impressive display, or to see Lin's straight-up animosity evolve into respect. There's also just the surface-level amusing irony of having the children of fun, carefree Aang and Toph grow up into complete sticks in the mud. If anything, Aang's optimism, free spirit, and chaotic childish energy got split up between his three grandkids. And while Milo's propensity for farts and borderline uncanny character design are an issue for me, he, Iki, and Jinora are endearing, and I'm glad they're here so the show isn't all self-serious, politically minded teens and adults. Pema is sweet, if unmemorable, and overall I like what the family unit provides for Korra. Bolin doesn't really have an arc this season. He helps to ground Mako in at least something outside of the love triangle, so that's neat. On his own though, he's just the comic relief, and you could easily imagine the story without him. Much like Mako for Zuko, Bolin comes off like a very shallow attempt to recapture the magic of Sokka. No offense to the voice actors, but it even comes off a bit like they were looking for Zuko and Sokka sound-alikes in casting. Which is weird, since Dante Bosco is here anyway. General Iroh honestly kinda bothers me. He's a character who pops up in the last quarter of the season with zero investment from the audience beyond his superficial existence as a proxy for all the fans to indulge in their fond memories of how cool Zuko, Iroh the First, or Dante Bosco are. He'd honestly be one of the first things that I completely eliminated to make way for more development of the other characters, or even just tightening up the story. Knowing that his presence will only shrink smaller and smaller with each progressive season, all of his scenes in retrospect feel like a waste of time. Naga and Pabu are cute, but they aren't nearly as iconic and lovable as Appa and Momo. And that's really all I have to say about them across all 4 seasons. To briefly touch back on the main cast, Team Avatar 2.0 just doesn't have the same appeal that Aang, Sokka, Katara, Toph, and eventually Zuko do. And I wouldn't even have a problem with this if it didn't feel like they were trying so hard to recapture that feeling. If you imagine for a moment that LOK existed in a vacuum, not as a sequel to anything, then the choice to position these 4 as a central team feels almost arbitrary. The original Team Avatar had clashing personalities, especially once Toph and Zuko were thrown into the mix, but there was, a smoothness to it. You don't even remotely question it when they're all just goofing off and having a good time together, or when the central conflict has resolved and they all still choose to hang around and be in each other's lives. Here, the love quadrangle mostly just leaves Korra, Mako, Bolin, and Asami stiff and awkward around each other. Eventually, the show works out a dynamic where these four naturally complement each other, but it's slow going. Overall, Season 1 is what I'd call one of those worse than the sum of its parts type things. It's respectably ambitious, and a lot about it does work, but unfortunately it's just really poorly written in too many places. Spirits is almost universally regarded as the show's low point. I have friends who dropped off Korra in the middle of Season 2, and friends who, even after sticking it out for 3 and 4, wish they could eliminate Season 2 from memory, comparing it unfavorably to even their least favorite TV shows. Jeez, guys. And it sucks because on paper there's a lot of good stuff this season. We get to spend at least a little while outside of Republic City to see how the Southern Water Tribe has evolved. Korra has to fight her own family as the Southern and Northern tribes escalate into a full-on civil war. That Unalaq is a spiritual zealot differentiates him from the pack a little bit, but once Vaatu arrives, we once again have a pair of villains who between them aren't a fraction as interesting as one Zuko or Azula. Key to this season not working for many people is Korra herself. You get the sense that maybe the writers were conscious of what I'd mentioned in the airbending section, that Korra hadn't really gotten the chance to grow in a meaningful way by the end of Season 1. And so they dedicated Season 2 to piling on more and more just how stagnant she'd been allowed to be while still getting her way. In the first half of Spirits, Korra's bravado and bullheadedness threatens to destroy a lot of relationships, and I can absolutely see the value in pushing that idea as far as it will go before making a turnaround and having her mellow out in the later episodes. The problem is that in the moment it still makes her difficult to empathize with, and that transition to a more mellow Korra doesn't entirely track for me. For the first half of Spirits, there's few words that describe Korra better than bratty. I mean, the establishing character moment of the season is her using the Avatar state to win a race against children. She's dismissive and confrontational with seemingly everyone who wants the best for her, though I can at least buy that she thinks she's making the smart decision until the episode Peacekeepers, where she goes completely buck wild. Now, obviously the idea here is that she's spiritually out of whack, which is literalized when that episode ends with an attack that leaves her amnesiac. The show deliberately pushed Korra to be the worst of herself so it could basically hard reset her personality and outlook halfway through the season, which is a bold choice. But it's honestly no wonder people couldn't wait that long and dropped the show altogether when our protagonist storms into her significant other's workplace and then destroys property like a petulant child because he disagrees with her. It's no surprise the next 3 episodes of the show barely feature Korra, since odds are the staff could tell viewers would need a buffer from the character after all this. 2 of those are the episodes about Avatar 1, and beyond the abstract notion that Korra gets spiritually recentered upon learning what the first Avatar was all about, I'm just not sure what it is about Wan's story that actually pertains to the growth Korra needed to undergo as a person. She pops out of the spirit bath having seemingly learned her lesson, but it honestly feels like another cop-out. Korra never actually had to directly confront her numerous anger and entitlement issues. She just kinda has them erased by watching a double-episode flashback. It certainly feels like the arc for Korra across the season is meant to be about her self-identity issues and how that contributes to her attitude problems, but it seems like there's a link missing regarding how that's informed by her learning of Wan's story. Korra goes from ludicrously volatile and immature to comparatively lucid and put together like a light switch, and I'm not sure what it is about Wan's tale that gets her there. That lack of cohesion, I think, makes it so some viewers don't really internalize Korra's change, and they end the season still disliking her. It doesn't help that we end this season about spirituality on a big, stupid kaiju beam fight that's all about shows of force, thus also not effectively externalizing Korra's alleged growth away from bullheaded force and physicality. Now, let's talk about that double-episode flashback. The Wan episodes were almost universally viewed as the high point of Season 2 at the time of release, and it's easy to see why. They're really refreshing in the context of the rest of the season, since they almost feel like a backdoor pilot. New characters, new setting, new art style, and kind of a new tone and feel. And taken both in a vacuum and as an escape from a problematic season surrounding it, there's a lot of reasons to love this two-parter. But boy, do I not really care for its contributions to the lore. Man, do I dislike the idea of bending as a thing that the lion turtles just pass out and take away as a tool for hunting and gathering, as opposed to a thing humanity cultivated as a community with the help of nature around them. There was just something so esoteric and charming about people learning earthbending from the badger moles, firebending from the dragons, airbending from the sky bison. Now all of that is overridden by this idea which to me makes bending feel far more generic. Instead of bending being this product of separate cultures learning from their environment until it becomes a part of them, it's just some elemental superpower that gets handed out like candy. And whichever one people get is just a quirk of whichever god turtle they happen to live on. To borrow a term from the excellent Nothing But Static podcast, if you really wanted to, you could fansplain the two origins of bending as coexisting, but I genuinely think the writers just didn't think about it. I also dislike the idea of the Avatar as a literal spirit-human hybrid born of convenience. I get that this is broaching headcanon territory, but I've never felt it fitting that some individual figure or figures consciously decide to form the Avatar. Part of that, granted, is in the way that Rava is characterized. She feels, for lack of a better word, too human, when I prefer that the Avatar's inception be something more ethereal. I always like to think that after the four bending styles developed, the Avatar just appeared one day, like the guiding hand of the universe needed them to exist. With the whole Rava and Vatu thing, it just feels wrong that the Avatar spirit is a thing you could literally pull out of a person, like what happens toward the end of the season. Now Juan, or as he might be called by a VTuber,
Dinky,
is himself a likable enough character to carry us through the story of these two episodes. And like I said, there are merits to this story. I like the idea that the Avatar meant to bridge the human and spirit worlds is also the person responsible for initially throwing both into complete chaos. When Juan accidentally unleashes a giant kite that starts spreading dark spores all over the spirits like Kenichi Joji. Any Digimon fans in the audience? Anyone? Okay. It's honestly kind of funny how split my thoughts are on these major story elements, given that splits and divides are basically the major motifs of the season. You could just as easily have titled Book 2 Balance, for reasons I find interesting to think about even if they don't fully compel you on screen. Almost every conflict in Season 2 involves characters perceiving seemingly incompatible binaries, be that in situations or in people. Korra is always demanding others, especially Mako, pick sides on an issue. The big question of the season is if spirits and humans can occupy the same space, or if they have to live in two separate planes of existence forever. We see two factions of a nation split against each other for the first time. Tenzin, Kaya, and Bumi have to reconcile two very different ideas about their father. Bolin has to negotiate and navigate the difference between the world of reality and that of the movers. Varric is a duplicitous scoundrel who sees both sides of a conflict and stokes both for profit, therefore being both friend and foe. In this sense, Book 2 at least manages to achieve some feeling of complexity and maturity in its storytelling. It's also where one of the few tangible improvements from Season 1 exists, namely Mako. In Book 2, Mako asserts his place as the stalwart, cautious, consider-all-sides member of the team. The critical thinker who benefits from not being too biased on any given issue and never throwing himself as blindly and wholeheartedly into things as Korra, Bolin, and even Asami do. He's always in the right when Korra accuses him of not picking sides, and it's him who sees through Varric while everyone else lets the benefits that Varric provides them overshadow anything else. Mako feels like a real, independently compelling and thematically relevant character in Spirits, and the episode that's just following his investigation into Varric after Korra blows up and disappears is probably my favorite of the bunch. A lot of that might just be Varric himself, though. Icknick Blackstone Varric is the man who practically carries this whole season on his back. The vocal performance by John Michael Higgins is full of over-the-top charisma. Whenever he's the focus of the scene, the energy is just on. For the first time, LOK gives us an overtly comedic character who has a sense of genuine complexity and a narrative stake, playing on his ability to charm alone to shroud his nature as kind of a villain. Really think about it. The show doesn't pull any cheeky attempts at misdirection or bother having Varric put up a front the way that Tarlok or Unalaq do. The show tells you up front and repeatedly that Varric is a shamelessly greedy, amoral war profiteer who's not above some serious underhanded tactics to get what he wants. And yet it hardly registers that he might actually be a shady character until Mako pieces it together, because that usually manifests as him helping out our heroes. He's got the same appeal as Iki and Milo, only cranked up to 11. This kooky oddball who's got his switch flipped on all the time. I genuinely think the season would be far tougher to get through if this character weren't such a big part of it. On a related note, it's diverting enough to see Varric pull Bolin through the Hollywood life through the Nuktuk movers, though I gotta admit, I never find the actual film serial pastiche sequences all that funny. I've just seen that aesthetic parodied too often to find it novel, even in this setting. It's mainly just interesting in retrospect to see Bolin's innocent naivety and insecurity give way to all the artifice and ego of the silver screen, contrasting his Nuktuk persona and very thin layer of faux bravado off-camera with the truly confident young man he'll grow into in later seasons. It's also fun to see the show continue to fold the Industrial Revolution into its storytelling, this time in the form of mass media as a propaganda tool. The family drama between Tenzin, Kaya, and Bumi is another highlight of the season for a lot of people, and I gotta say, aside from Mako, I think Tenzin was the character best served by Spirits. The man is just going through it across this whole run of episodes. The guy has to deal with being mentored to a bratty avatar who doesn't appreciate him, to then having his ostensible vacation marred with some genuinely heavy and cutting arguments with his siblings that challenge his long-standing veneration of his father. Then, when Korra mends the bridge and accepts his help, he proves useless at getting her into the spirit world next to his own preteen daughter. There's something real cathartic about having him go through all that and then having it all culminate in this moment in the spirit fog, where the spirit of Aang arrives to let him know that being himself matters more than being his father's son, and how as a result of that he's able to lead his family out of their own madness. It's also just nice that so much of Tenzin's stuff in the front half of Book 2 plays out like short, sweet, intimate vignettes, which are way more engaging than what Korra has going on. Tenzin is really the most compelling figure across this season, and he's the only one with a fully realized arc that I feel pans out well. Kaya and Bumi are nice, if a bit obnoxious in the latter's case. I like how the conflict between the three siblings plays out as something genuinely adult, for lack of a better word. And despite being so completely different to each other, you buy that all three of them ended up the way they are as a result of the exact same family situation. Iki and Milo have very limited roles this season, relegated pretty exclusively to one episode apiece, where they have a fittingly childish conflict which informs or mirrors their dad's more adult concerns in some way. Jinora gets the most to do of the three kids, though I can't exactly call her material great. I like the stuff regarding her being Korra's spirit guide. Her defining trait up to this point is basically being the family's spiritual prodigy, so centering a chunk of spirits on her makes perfect sense. The problem, then, is that we don't really center all that much. We establish a big reaction from her when Korra opens the spirit portals at the top of the season, and then she falls by the wayside for the entire middle chunk of the story, gets one really good use where she leads Korra to the spirit realm, and then has to navigate through it herself, and then she's just another factor in the big, dumb, stupid, dumb kaiju fight at the end. I don't even want to say that this is a case of the show having too much going on to accommodate Jinora. It just feels like she was one of the variables in the season they were least interested in. I find the twins Eska and Desna fairly funny, though I think they're integrated more clumsily than someone like Varric. For one, the pseudo-romance between Eska and Bolin is played 90% for dark comedy before being amicably dropped in the final minutes of the season, which on the one hand is good because I'd rather spend time on a goofy joke of a romance than I would on more straightforward romantic melodrama, especially since Spirits is still teasing out the love triangle of last season. On the other hand, knowing from the start that there's no way Bolin and Eska go anywhere by the end just makes the whole thing feel like a waste of time. It just felt like, I don't know, the writers really wanted stuff for both of them to do while the story happened to be set in the South Pole. I do like the one scene where Desna's exterior breaks in defense of his father, only for Unalaq to totally disregard his life later. I just feel that with all the drama that's wrung from the family drama angle of Unalaq's villainy, these two are left kinda wanting, and honestly could have just been one character for all they serve the story. Also sadly left wanting is Asami. Don't get me wrong, she has her fair share of cool and funny moments, but with all the other active players in the season, she's the one of the main four with the least to do. Like Bolin, she gets suckered in by Varric, and I like the bits of drama we do pull out of the fact that she's now a desperate teenager running a whole corporation. I suppose I just wish that part of her character wasn't ultimately used to push her back into Mako's arms, and that we'd found something proactive for her to do in the endgame. Vaatu is a giant evil kite. That's it. Taken in bullet points the way I'm presenting it, Season 2 definitely seems like a mixed bag, and while the good parts of it make me personally glad I watched it, I don't want to undersell how much of a slog some of that viewing absolutely was. It's disjointed, overstuffed, thematically sparse when it's not just contradicting itself. Korra can get really intolerable, and the themes don't really coalesce the way they want to. It's frankly a mess, and I don't for one moment disagree with the consensus that it's the weakest of the show's writing. Too many of its positives lie in the secondary or comparatively understated elements, while so many of its big central character and story choices are just frustrating. We could have had something wholly better than Season 1 if the villains and Korra's own journey were handled with more care. Don't worry though, folks. Good things are coming our way. Season 2, despite being really weak, does set up Season 3 in a really neat fashion. Whereas Book 1 ends with a series of massive cop-outs on account of the production team being told that they would only have the one season, Season 3 was almost bound to be the best one yet by virtue of having such a neat status quo setup. And let's just say, they did not disappoint. Change begins with an episode titled A Breath of Fresh Air, and boy does it feel like it. Inflammatory title of this video aside, I've mostly been speaking about this show and my problems with it academically. But trust me when I say that I wasn't emotionally satisfied watching a lot of Season 1 and 2. And that as early as this first episode of Book 3, there's a palpable shift in my emotional investment. And granted, part of that might be confirmation bias. Long before this video was even planned to be made, I'd thought back on Seasons 3 and 4 as when the show really gets good, but I really get the sense something changed behind the scenes here. Like the staff has really managed to get their own act together by this point in the show. We get nice, mellow, relationship-driven scenes in this episode between Korra and Asami, and also Tenzin and his kids. And they each just hit different than any of the other attempts at the same across previous seasons. It really strikes me how A Breath of Fresh Air has one of the first scenes in the whole show where it really feels like Tenzin is a father to these kids, and where that's a relationship I care about and find heartwarming. While the integration of spirits and humans ultimately ends up being more of an excuse to make the cast's transition away from Republic City smoother by turning the city against Korra, for this initial stretch of the story, the show effectively handles the difficulties of integration. It's great to get this fallout from the end of last season, and the show finally manages to succeed at what it's attempted multiple times, that being interrogating Korra's stubborn attitude while keeping her sympathetic. Scenes like this one where she finds herself calmly empathizing with the newly discovered airbender who gets himself stuck on a bridge is great, and it sets the tone for a season where Korra does a much better job being a woman of the people. An interesting point is raised by Tenzin early on, which ends up dictating the route the show goes down. Bringing balance means, ironically, that some people won't be happy. The whole season ends up being Korra and the gang grappling with those who are resistant to change made in the name of balance. Not just in the people they actually fight, either. The crop of new airbenders awakened by Korra's opening of the spirit portal leads to a stretch of episodes dedicated to finding and training these individuals, and just like Republic City having to integrate the spirits, they're used as a means of ruminating on sudden changes to one's very way of life. Tenzin naturally gets the brunt of this, spending most of the season with the airbenders, and through him we get the sense that a big part of successfully transitioning people through a big change is how you package it. Be that in how you pitch the airbender lifestyle, or in how you train the new recruits. Zahir, the new villain of the season, knows how to pitch radical change to people, much more so than Korra does, which ends up being the source for much of Korra's problems. There's really three big factors making up the story of Season 3. The airbenders, of course, Zaofu, and the villains, and change is at the center of each one. In Zaofu, we continue our trend of all the adult siblings in LOK having a metric ton of emotional baggage, as the crux of the conflict there is the friction between Sue and Lin. Lin, by nature of her own stubborn personality, but also by nature of her role in the story, is a character who hasn't had much opportunity to change. She's mended her schism with Tenzin, come to respect Korra and later Mako, of course, but fundamentally, Lin opened Season 3 as the same person she was at the top of Season 1. And the personal biases that she's held on to about crime and her own rightness inform how reluctant she is to accept change in her sister. And this is a great use of setting for story purposes. There isn't a single thing about Zaofu and the people who inhabit it that doesn't reflect positively on Sue and the inherent capacity for people to change. I love Zaofu as a setting, and I'm completely invested in everyone we meet there, their quirks, their drama. It's great characterization. And all of this is because the world building reflects the characters. Sue is responsible, open-minded, and competent enough to run what's basically a utopia, raise several children who all seem to have grown into healthy and functional young adults, and provide home and employment to multiple ex-cons, and she makes it look easy. But Lin can't see that. She can't see change. She can only see her little sister as she remembers her all those decades ago. And because this entire environment springs from Sue, Lin finds herself lashing out at everything. She lashes out at Opal because she can hardly even see the girl as anything but extension of Sue number 17. The way that Lin evolves into a warmer, more complete human being by just accepting that time has passed and things have changed is really engaging stuff. Also, Sue has a cute little transatlantic accent, aka the best accent. And hey, speaking of cute and Opal, I really like her. And I really like her and Bolin together, specifically the way that Opal is used to turn Bolin into a more genuine-feeling character. Their relationship threatens to get off to a rocky start because Bolin isn't quite being himself. And looking at his character through the lens of this inauthenticity really reframes his characterization in Seasons 1 and 2 as kind of an insecure glory hound. Part of what makes Opal so great for Bolin is how she's clearly internalized the environment her mother created, one which prioritizes pride in oneself and emotional openness. It's great that Bolin has someone in his life who can look at his behavior, pinpoint the cause, and then put him on the path to handling his insecurities more maturely. I talk about Bolin here because Zaofu is where most of his character development takes place. Yeah, he's got the struggles with metal bending, which then gives way to the discovery of his lava bending, but if I've got to lob any complaint at this season, it's that this is a bit too similar to Korra learning airbending, and that I don't think I can actually track the development of these powers to a character place. The other main characters kind of have their growth put on pause during the stretch at Zaofu. That is, until they come face to face with the season's antagonists. After Season 1 and 2 both gave us very generic, very similar villains, Season 3 grants a whole crew of interesting bad guys with unique abilities, a meaningful anarchic perspective and motivation, and human-feeling interpersonal relationships and rapport with each other. It really makes you remember how pivotal the relationships between Zuko and Iroh or Azula with Mai and Ty Lee were to making the central conflict of Last Airbender feel less like generic white hats versus black hats. Granted, the most important of these relationships hardly gets any focus to itself until we're suddenly hit with a quick bout of exposition at the very episode it becomes relevant, where Su Yin is responsible for what's probably the sickest kill in this show, like Jesus Christ. But given just how chock full of stuff Season 3 manages to be, I guess it only figures that some things would need that treatment. I was initially unsure how I felt about Zahir's voice acting until I eventually came around on it, but honestly, from Scene 1, I really like his character. Zahir has a compassion and humility about himself that seems genuine, or at the very least, you believe that Zahir believes that about himself. Zahir's whole mission in life is to be an agent of change, tearing down the political systems which have proven to be various degrees of corrupt over the course of this and Last Airbender. Having an airbending villain is fascinating, especially since his adherence to their teachings makes Zahir more air nomad than anyone else other than Tenzin. Heck, Zahir takes Tenzin's initial lesson about balance to its natural extreme. Not only does Zahir readily accept that some people will be resistant to change, but he's ready to murk anyone in order to bring that change about. Something I really like in the episode Long Live the Queen, aside from what's probably the second sickest kill in the show, is the direct contrast that's made between Korra and Zahir in their approach to the people they want to help. Both spend the episode in proximity with the middle-class workers of the Earth Kingdom, the oppression of whom we're given further insight into with the scenes of Mako and Bolin in prison. We're shown good people under the Earth Queen made to do her purely ego-driven dirty work, or separated from their families for years on end, all for opposing or even inconveniencing her. Korra, as she is wont to do, starts her relationship with the former group on a rocky, abrasive note, but quickly creates a relationship of equal respect. Meanwhile, Zahir does some genuine good for the latter by violently overthrowing the monarchy and releasing the wrongfully imprisoned, but in the process of doing all this also sets the stage for loots and rioting and then leaves them to their own devices with nary any hint of guidance. Now, far be it from me as a black guy in 2023 to even try and claim that riots or looting against a corrupt system is somehow a bad thing, but taken in the context of the whole season, I think there's interesting implications here. That Zahir sees almost no value in community of any kind. He outright states that in his perfect world, individuals should only be concerned with themselves or their immediate loved ones. But this loses sight of the fact that community is indeed necessary to achieve proper balance. The issue with tyrants like the Earth Queen is that they did only look out for themselves, and the system of monarchy allowed them to do that at everyone else's expense. This is an idea that gets heavily expanded on in Season 4, but Zahir's biggest impact on the world is probably pushing it in a direction away from monarchic power, and towards a new system which will allow things like the proper return of the air nomad culture. The same air nomads who literally pull Zahir down to earth by working together as a nascent community of people from different backgrounds all over the world. If anything, Korra is the one who actually restores a level of natural order through her revival of the airbenders and her maintenance of their return to a proper culture. And I mean, how dope is it that the key to her taking down Zahir, literally grounding him, is the very chain which he placed on her in the name of unchained, selfish freedom for the rest of the world. Speaking of working together, I mentioned Korra herself being more amicable with others this season, and that comes out in our main foursome dynamic. Back in Season 1, I had problems with Team Avatar 2.0 feeling derivative and lackluster. Like, they wanted really hard to recapture the feeling of the original Team Avatar, and couldn't do it with such thin or abrasive characters and relationships. Boy, is that gone now. While Season 2 split the cast into small groups with a very clean split between 3 plot lines, Season 3 keeps the majority of the cast together for large swaths of the story. And it feels like they've really worked out what the dynamic is supposed to be this time. The show's obsession with romantic drama recedes this season. Heck, the only romance we get at all is Jinora and Kai and Opal with Bolin, both of which are more cute, straightforward, and wholesome than they are a source of contrived drama. And the main characters really feel like a tight-knit group of friends now that everything isn't being overshadowed by Korra's tumultuous relationship with Mako. Key to this is, maybe unsurprisingly, Korra and Asami. Bolin and Mako already had a natural chemistry, and the love triangle being kiboshed opened the door for Mako to interact with the girls in more straightforward ways that just let their characters naturally gel. Almost immediately, though, the season has Korra and Asami spending most of their time paired off with each other, and the way they bounce off of and complement each other is just great. They're always openly communicating, encouraging each other, fighting together, and dunking on Mako together. Their chemistry is just so palpable, and you can see why this is the foundation for their eventual romance in just how much more right they are for each other than either of them was for Mako. In terms of the other characters, Tenzin gets some neat stuff to do. Much like in Spirits, Tenzin finds himself pressured to lead the way on cementing parts of his dad's legacy. But in this case, he managed to better live up to the task. There's friction between him and his recruits, but when push comes to shove, he proves to really be the leader that the Air Nation needs. Jinora gets a similar arc, and Change is probably the only book which really does her character justice. She's got her puppy love with Kai, who himself is a neat example of how people can change for the better, but more so than that, Jinora is a proactive character who more than earns her place as the Ascendant student by season's end, which is remarkable given that again she has comparatively little screen time. That's emblematic of the season as a whole, to be honest. Change feels like it's using its screen time a lot more economically than Spirits and Air did. While the earlier 2 seasons felt a bit padded even in their best episodes, each episode of Change is chocked full to the brim with engaging material. Episodes feel almost like full movies, but I get so invested that even when they end, it feels like things were just getting started. Does that make any sense? Yeah, you guys get it. Even when stuff isn't directly advancing the plot and can be considered downtime, I'm really enjoying it. The main four having a stakeout, the bulk of which is Asami and Bolin having a pie showdown. Awesome. That stuff is hilarious. It's the kind of padding that feels like necessary breathing room in a season otherwise unflinchingly committed to shoving in as much meaningful balance of action, forward plot motion, and character and story development as I'd imagine was possible. Jinora may not show up a ton, but she doesn't feel lost in the shuffle the way she did before. Kaya and Bumi both continue to get neat stuff to do. We get a bit of input from Eiji to Zuko, and the minor roles we get in the form of the new airbenders aside from Kai and Opal are just enough to make you care about them as a whole population, and feel pride in simple things like them pulling off Jinora's ceremony at the end. You really feel glad that these saps have come so far. I made some bones about the action feeling a bit generic in the first half of this show, but now that we're in the latter half, I feel like some really interesting things are being done. Seasons 1 and 2 have solid choreography, but the actual setup of the fights themselves was rarely that interesting. It was often just a bunch of straightforward contests of strength. Contrast something like the big fight in Book 3, Episode 8, which is all ingenuity and constant reversals and a really neat, unique configuration that isn't just a figurative punching match. Ditto the fight where Korra has her arms and legs handcuffed and has to bend with that limited physicality. Or Tenzin, Kai, and Bumi versus the Red Lotus at the Air Temple. The uses of bending are also just so consistently clever. The armless waterbending lady using water with clothes on as a decoy for a group of hostages is brilliant. Overall, I'd describe change as the peak of this show. The wheels get turning in a big way, and while I can see the beginnings of what will ultimately hold Book 4 back from perfection, namely just how many things there are to juggle, change is as close to perfect as Korra's balancing act ever gets. I'm invested in everyone, I jive with the whole story's sense of energy, the themes fully come through in the narrative, and for the first time I'm 100% on Korra's side. Finally, much like last season, we leave the stage set for the story to take another new, compelling turn. And once again, we don't disappoint. How does an avatar react when it seems like the world is doing just fine and achieving balance without her? For Korra, this question probably hits home harder than most. Despite having the shortest amount of time in the history of the show between seasonal air dates, Balance makes the unprecedented choice of opening 3 full years after Korra suffers her debilitating injury at the end of Change. And the world is seemingly getting on fine without her input. Korra's impatience and impulsivity has been her defining flaw throughout the show, and what we learn here is that stems from her expectations of herself. From her very first scene as a toddler, Korra was established as an avatar with more raw talent than most. And it's that status as a prodigy on top of everything else that leads to her rejecting the help of others, and feeling compelled to always be acting. While there are certainly aspects of her arcs in seasons 1 and 2 that let her down, as I've gone over, the most consistently well-done part of her journey as a character throughout the entire show has been how Korra navigates expectation. While Aang struggled with the desire to shirk his avatar responsibilities, Korra embraces every single one of those responsibilities head-on, and struggles instead to meet the bar set for how effectively she should do those things. Which I'm gonna say is, it's around the moon? Maybe she can ask Yue to kick it down a bit. We know 2 things about Korra from the instant that we meet her: that she's a prodigy, and that she's active in shaping her own role in the world. Which are the perfect pair of traits to have if you want to always be chafing hard at any kind of real adversity. The root of all Korra's struggles, from her relationships with other people, to her status as a political figure, to her hard luck with spirituality, is her need to always be looking outward, always acting to meet expectations. She always has something to prove. I bring this all up now because it's in Season 4 where Korra finally has to confront that part of herself. It's her arc in Balance that I think finally cracks the code on what Korra always needed to become a complete person. And in retrospect, it's Season 4 that makes viewing the rest of her character through this lens all the more satisfying. Korra's injury stops her from acting, and when it seems like all of her friends, and even Kuvira, have got the world on lock without her, Korra goes into full-on crisis mode. Who is she if she can't actively be shaping the world? I think the importance of having Korra's trauma manifest as herself in the Avatar state lies in how it symbolizes Korra plus the baggage of past avatars. All just one more layer of expectation Korra is constantly battling. Aged Toph points out that Korra's scared of actually healing because she doesn't want to have to get back into the action and risk getting hurt again, but I think more pivotal to Korra's completion is the one-episode appearance by Zahir. Keeping Zahir alive at the end of Season 3 and then bringing him back for Season 4 was a stroke of pure tactical genius that would make Azula proud, because it lets Korra learn the lesson she's really needed to since the first episode of this series, to truly accept and move past her own failures, to know that it's okay to stop fighting battles that are already finished, that her moments of suffering are in the past, meant to be internalized and moved beyond. Something that's learned from, not something continuously struggled against for the rest of her life. In that sense, Toph is more right than she knows, in that Korra isn't just not healing out of fear of getting hurt. She's not healing because, to her, every fight is the fight with Zahir on replay, and every possibility of failure rings almost like a certainty of a similar outcome. It's genuinely crippling for her, and Janet Varney does such a good job playing Korra not just temperamental, but legitimately shell-shocked and depressed. I think the terms of forever being stuck in a battle that you've already finished is a great way to frame Korra's PTSD. And when she finally gets over it by accepting what's been done to her and internalizing, it's the perfect culmination and refutation of every time we've seen her lash out and externalize over an obstacle, personal failure, or loss over the course of all 4 seasons. This is just brilliant stuff. At the center of a lot of this, of course, is Korra's foil in the season villain. The entire series' approach to villains is really interesting, even when the individual characters are not. With the exception of Vaatu and the Red Lotus, they all play almost like twist villains. I say almost because I don't think most of us in the stands are remotely shocked when Tarlok, Unalaq, or Kuvira turn out malevolent. But the initial trust that the protagonists place in them allows for a kind of proximity that you never get in children's media. In contrast to something more structurally conventional like ATLA, in the sense of a good faction and a bad faction, however nuanced they may be, starting from opposite ends and slowly approaching a climactic confrontation, LOK gives us heroes and villains who start adjacent to each other before they split off on a key issue or belief. Aang would occasionally bump into Zuko, Zhao, and Azula across books 1 and 2, and never come face-to-face with Ozai until the final episode. Korra and her crew, by contrast, are constantly just around their villains, having conversations, bouncing off each other's ideologies, trading hits, shadowing, and reacting to each other in real time. Heck, Zahir shows up as a pseudo-ally in Season 4 just to highlight how comparatively blurry the lines have gotten. Toph lays out how all of Korra's antagonists have had understandable and in some ways admirable motivations, despite often taking things to a way too extreme place. By the end of the season, we have a Korra who says herself, in no uncertain terms, that she needs to have compassion for even those who are far gone as Kuvira was, and that it was her injury which opened the door for her to learn that compassion. Compare that to the earlier Korra, who so often sacrificed that same compassion for the sake of bravado, because she was always physically able to back that bravado up. In the end, what Korra's story becomes when viewed as a whole is a young woman learning that the best way to live up to otherwise crippling expectations is to just be kind, both to others and to herself. Now, let's talk about Kuvira, or as my sister Eden calls her, literally Fidel Castro. Kuvira is openly and explicitly fascist, right down to supporting racial segregation. Under her, the Earth Empire is basically Ozai's Fire Nation under a different name. Her flashback discussion with Sue about uniting the kingdom gives off serious Firelord Sozin vibes. And I mean, she has re-education camps. Something really smart that this season does is build so directly on the plot points of Season 3. Specifically, Kuvira finds herself radicalized into hostile takeover mode by the failure of anyone else to effectively take care of the Earth Kingdom after Zahir left it in a riotous frenzy. In that way, Kuvira is almost like Zahir's direct opposite, and the show draws explicit parallels between Kuvira and Korra. I like this specifically as one of the more subtle ways that parallel comes through. The fact that, like Korra so often did, Kuvira holds this "I'm the only one who seems willing to do what needs to be done, so I might as well do it to a ridiculous extreme" attitude. Kuvira really is reminiscent of what you could see Korra becoming at her worst. She's a bull-headed woman of action with a simplistic view of right and wrong, jumping right to ultimatums when others don't see her way, then threatening violence when that doesn't work. I like to think that part of the reason it works to have Korra decide to stop fighting and empathize with her is that Kuvira gets to see someone she eventually has no choice but to recognize as similar to herself, proving capable of that tactic. Prior to that moment, her character is definitely in line with someone who put up all the metal walls around her real feelings of fear for the good of her nation. Thematically suitable, then, that the final, literal form of that shell is an awesomely ridiculous giant robot with a nuclear arm cannon. That fear that makes them lash out being another thing she and Korra have in common. Honestly, though, the reason the robot works where something like the spirit kaijus didn't is that it's also a natural extension of the industrial progression that we've had since the start of the series. When Korra turns big and blue and starts shooting energy beams out of her chest, I groan. When I watch the season ramp up to the entire cast facing off against mecha fascism, even knowing how the show ends, it creates levels of excited tension in me that runs through the whole final 3 episodes. And going back to that arm cannon, I don't primarily call it nuclear out of jest. What we have in this season is the development of the Avatar world's first WMD. And it makes sense to have the final threat of this action series with industrial themes be their equivalent to the nuclear singularity. And to interrogate the development of that singularity not just through Kuvira, but through my main man Varrick. Varrick is back to having a major role after being only a minor appearance in Season 3. And while there's a bit of a leap for his character, what we do with him is more than good enough to justify it. Namely, I mean the sudden development of a conscience and empathy on his part, seemingly between seasons. That said, if you wanted to be more charitable with my read, you could say that it makes total sense for the show to make a statement by having the beginnings of the Spirit Vine weapon be where Varrick decides to draw the line. You know the weapons of mass destruction are an unconscionable evil when even the guy who seemingly never thought about another person's well-being in his life is suddenly flooded with concern over the harm it could do. I mean, personally, even I think this is a bit of a stretch, and with the amount of screen time and relevance that's given to his relationship with Julie this season, I'd have liked if that relationship had been the impetus for Varrick's growth into a better person, rather than that just happening independently. That said, I love their relationship. I love seeing Julie get fleshed out, and I love Varrick's arc regardless, in part because he splits the lion's share of it with Bolin. Bolin is at his best in Season 4, an easy highlight of the whole thing, and pairing him with Varrick is key to that fact because it underlines just how much he's grown without even realizing it. Bolin finds himself in much the same position and balance as he did in Spirits, having his good heart and, more importantly, his people skills manipulated by an opportunistic villain to their own ends. First it was with Varrick, now it's with Kuvira. Bolin finds himself as a proxy for all of the impressionable, low-ranking guys who initially mean well, but are kept in the dark and quickly indoctrinated into supporting fascism under the guise of benevolent intervention. The difference being that in Season 2, Bolin spent almost the entire thing completely oblivious to Varrick's dark side, whereas here, we get the impression that he has reservations from the very beginning. In defecting with Varrick, Bolin gets to look his former manipulator in the face and prove a cogent, mature motivator and altruistic influence. Finally, something more than just a dim kid with his heart in the right place. Bolin and Varrick's redemptive arc together really works, with the pair having to accept responsibility for the role that they both helped play assisting Kuvira, not only in the grand scheme of the people her regime has hurt, but in the intimate relationships that they have to work to rebuild. Opal is a really interesting figure this season, both in the way that her relationship with Bolin is clearly the impetus for his growth as a character, and in how she's often torn between her devotion to her family and the ethos of the Air Nation. Bolin and Varrick also, naturally, continue to be really funny, even if that only draws negative comparison for some people with what is now the show's 5 billionth new comedic side character, Prince Wu. Wu is one of the ways in which you can actually see where Kuvira is coming from, in regards to the Earth Kingdom's need for strong leadership. Honestly, forget just the Earth Kingdom. With the single exception of Zuko, Avatar as a franchise has been consistently, harshly critical of monarchs within the story. And Wu spends 80% of his time on screen as maybe the harshest critique yet. He's petty, ineffectual, pathetic, lecherous, and yet still nefarious enough to know what a good person looks like and attempt to put on that face to court the ladies. It's only fitting that Wu becoming likable, or even just tolerable, coincides with him dissolving the monarchy, and maybe getting out of politics altogether. I also think it's really appropriate for that messaging that Mako is the one saddled with Wu for the whole season. Mako, who even more than Bolin defines himself by his past as a homeless orphan. Things don't get as class-conscious as that sentence makes it sound, but the subtext of Wu going from a potential king so bad he really does make Kuvira look favorable by comparison to an actual man of the people, seemingly without even realizing it, speaks for itself. As mentioned, LOK loves to meet its villains halfway, and while Kuvira goes way too far to be tolerated as she is, it's fitting that she in part represents inexorable modernity, and also kind of gets what she wants with a united but still free Earth Kingdom likely in better hands than we the audience have ever seen them. Also, I really do just find much of Wu's shenanigans genuinely funny, though his brand of humor will absolutely not work for everyone. When you're done talking about the characters I've mentioned already, Season 4 becomes kinda difficult to discuss, since what you're left with is a very large ensemble who mostly get really good scattered moments rather than tangible arcs. And I think the cause of that is the cause for all of the reservations I voiced throughout the discussion of those larger arcs. Namely that Season 4 of Korra, while it tried valiantly to be as tight as it can be, is where the show at last reached the threshold of too many characters. Season 3 was already stuffed to the brim with characters, arcs, and plot, and Season 4 unfortunately starts having to jettison a lot of elements to avoid busting at the seams. The Kai and Jinora relationship, which was a decently sized part of Season 3, only gets a single offhand mention in balance, and characters like Kai himself are really only relevant to one episode, while others like Bumi and Kaya are essentially cameos. Some characters who do get to be prominent through chunks of the season, like Opal, don't really get a conclusive final moment. It's really clear that Season 4 has a lot of beats that it wants to hit, and it hits them all well, but it's like watching someone run from task to task with the absolute certainty that they're going to keel over and sleep for 3 days straight after they nail the landing and score a solid 9.5. Okay, the metaphor kinda got away from me there, but you know what I mean. In some alternate universe out there, some genius working under Earth 838 Nickelodeon Studios had the idea for Seasons 3 and 4 way earlier in production, and the perfect version of The Legend of Korra came out with the Red Lotus and Kuvira storylines told in a slightly more leisurely fashion across 3 or 4 whole seasons, maybe with the Equalist arc running as a background thing across one or both. Somebody hire me, I think I'm pretty smart. I also wonder if Season 4 as it is wouldn't have benefited from not spending an episode's worth of time on a whole series clip show, despite that actually being a pretty decent character-driven use of the trope, what with having characters reminisce in story about how far they have, or haven't, come, contextualizing the whole series into one long continuous journey. You know, when it's not Varric twisting Season 2 into a ludicrous fanfiction that's still probably more interesting than the actual Season 2. TLDR, Book 4 manages to barely avoid feeling horribly cramped and rushed, but only by chopping off half of the cast and their assorted baggage like an infected limb. And while that approach makes for TV that's perfectly up to par with Season 3 in terms of quality, it's a choice that risks pleasing less people than Season 3 managed to. But Season 3 doesn't have Korra using earthbending to play with Naga in this adorable scene, so does anything else really matter? In all seriousness, let's talk about what in retrospect became one of Legend of Korra's biggest selling points, and unfortunately is something that I feel suffers due to the aforementioned amputation of Season 4. Let's talk about Asami. Sadly, I think the two of them spend way too much of the final season apart from each other. In terms of setup for the two of them as a pairing, what we get in Season 4 is Korra responding to Asami's letters, but no one else's, their interactions in Reunion, and some tiny cute moments in the clip show episode. Take that out of it, and the two have hardly any scenes or dialogue together that isn't furthering plot. Now, don't take this the wrong way. I love Korrasami. Korrasami OTP. And the reason I and so many others found their getting together so satisfying is that we picked up on the very obvious chemistry and rapport and hints of deeper affection and understanding between them in earlier seasons, most especially Season 3. But that's just the thing. Season 3 was the foundation on which the majority of Korrasami shipping was laid. And Season 4, like I've seen happen in lots of romantic pairings from lesser shows, leaves those invested in the ship with crumbs of further build-up before springing canonicity on us. Korra and Asami is solidifying a relationship with each other as the de facto romantic pair of the show is gangbusters as something built to throughout the previous seasons, and especially as the capper to something the fans had been building to in their own minds and within the fandom. But specifically as the note on which to end Season 4, this relationship, for as wonderful as it is and for as much sense as it makes, is a non-factor through most of Balance. The Last Airbender ends by doing basically the same thing with Aang and Katara, but the romantic teasing and tension between those two was debatably at its peak in Book 3. Here, we plant the seeds for a relationship, but then instead of watching them grow throughout the season, we barely water them for 13 episodes and then pull a villager from Smash Bros. By letting them sprout into a fully formed oak in the last scene. Just the arc of this string of episodes is impacted not even a little bit if you don't let these two get together, and I think that contributed to a lot of the complaints that it came out of nowhere. That and, homophobia. It's biphobia! Biphobia, right, sorry. And on that level, it's hard not to respect the ending, out of place as it might be. Korra and Asami took the first wibbly-wobbly baby-footed half-step into main queer characters in animated kid shows, so that shows like Adventure Time, She-Ra, or The Owl House could crawl, walk, and run. And I genuinely think we'd be in a different place right now with a lot of current shows were it not for this 3 minutes of screen time testing the waters. And that's actually important to people. Their final conversation does its best to contextualize itself as a natural endpoint for their separate arcs across the season, but my point stands that Balance could have stood to excise something in service of greater relationship setup. As is almost metatextually alluded to by Korra's final conversation with Tenzin, this show is one big bumpy ride. I don't think it's being mean to say that even at its peak, The Legend of Korra doesn't really compare to the heights of Last Airbender. Most animated shows on the planet can't rise to that challenge. Watching through the whole series, though, I feel like I witness a thoroughly mediocre show that's firmly in ATLA's shadow evolve completely into its own animal. Despite being screwed over by the network over and over and over again from the jump, despite a significantly lower episode count per season compared to Airbender, with a cast twice as big and plots twice as dense, The Legend of Korra really did become something great. It took characters I and many others initially saw as weak stand-ins for ATLA's beloved cast and crafted relationships and individual journeys I could actually care about. Revisiting it now multiple times for this video proved really fun, and hey, as is always the case, you should let me know in the comments if you'd like this kind of season-by-season deep dive done on any other shows, animated or otherwise. For now though, my throat's hoarse and this is going to be a pain to edit, so like and subscribe and I'll see you in the future.
Quite so, and might I say that I dig your tour jeté.
Crazy man!
Where did you get that quake and quiver?
It was way down upon the Swanee River.
I like your poise, that is, I'm keen about your stance. Say you could be the epitome of romance. What am I saying? Where, oh, where did you